Does anyone have anything in particular on your mind that you would like to ask a question about or to make initiate a discussion of?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've been reading that Mahayana Buddhism stresses that an enlightened being is a bodhisattva, or someone who is intent on enlightenment, and that bodhisattva is a big concept in Mahayana Buddhism, and that in the Theravada tradition, arhat is stressed more, and I'm not clear that the distinction between an arhat and a bodhisattva is all that big, but it appears to have been enough to create these two schools. Would you talk?
Yes, let me clarify that a little bit. The two schools, the Theravada and the Mahayana, both have in common that there is a first stage of enlightenment and then there's progressive enlightenment after that. And in the Theravada, the first stage of enlightenment is stream entry, which is the same thing in the Mahayana. There's no difference there. And the Theravadins use the word arhat to refer to the highest possible level of spiritual development. A Buddha is an arhat is a Buddha. They are identical. Where the Mahayana begins to depart, or historically began to depart from the Theravada, was with the idea that rather than seeking enlightenment for your own sake, you should be seeking enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Okay? Now, in both the Theravada and the Mahayana, the person we call the Buddha, the awakened one, Siddhartha Gautama, is called the Sammasambuddha, and that's what, in here. And Sammasam means the highest of the high. Now, in its original meaning, it's not that a Sammasambuddha is the slightest bit more enlightened than any other Buddha, any other Arhat, because Arhat and Buddha are exactly the same in that tradition. And a Sammasambuddha isn't any more enlightened because it's not possible to be more enlightened than Arhat. But a Sammasambuddha is somebody who is uniquely capable of teaching the Dharma to very large numbers of people. Right? And that's what sets him apart. Later on in both traditions, to answer the question of, well, what makes this guy so unique compared to the rest, they took the existing doctrine of reincarnation and they said, well, he spent 100 million lifetimes perfecting his virtue so that when he was born this time, he would not only be a Buddha, but he would be a Buddha that had this unique ability to teach others, and was the beginning of Buddhism. That's a little digression, but okay, so we have the tradition begins to diverge when one school is saying, rather than just seeking enlightenment for your own sake, we should all be doing what the Buddha did, seeking enlightenment so that we are able to guide others to become enlightened. This is the bodhisattva idea, and the name they gave to that was bodhicitta, which means, bodhicitta literally just means a mind set on becoming enlightened. You have bodhicitta. But in the Mahayana, they made it mean, they added to that, it's a being with a mindset on enlightenment for the sake of leading other beings to enlightenment, or for the sake of other beings. And so the bodhisattva ideal arose. And in order to reconcile some logical and philosophical problems, they, instead of saying that arhats and Sammasambuddha have the same level of enlightenment, in the Mahayana they came up with this new description of what an arhat was. And an arhat's not a completely enlightened being, only a Sammasambuddha is a completely enlightened being. That's a strictly Mahayana doctrine. But what it allowed them to do, and this was why it came into being, it allowed them to point to the non-Mahayana, who they gave the derogatory name Hinayana, lesser vehicle.
Okay.
It allowed them to point to these others and say, the highest goal that you aspire to is a lesser form of enlightenment, and it's inherently selfish. So that's where it comes from. So, in other words, the Mahayana Arhat is not the same as the Theravada Arhat. The Mahayana Arhat has been redefined to make it possible to define a higher level of enlightenment, complete enlightenment, total enlightenment, the kind of enlightenment that the Buddha had. But then what comes from this is that in the Mahayana, everyone should aspire to become a Sammasambuddha. Everybody should aspire to achieve that special ability that allows you not to help a few other people around you to become enlightened, but that you will have the same kind of impact on the world that the Buddha did. And this leads into a whole other cosmology in the Mahayana that does not exist in the Theravada, which is that there are all these Buddha realms. There have been many Buddhas in the past, and they still exist, each in their own Buddha realm. And there are Buddha realms in which there are future Buddhas who are actually already enlightened, but they're just waiting for their turn and their time to come. And so what started out, I think, as a wonderful idea became doctrinally more complex. And so you end up sort of with what you see now. What was your original question? There was I think I let that slip in my long-winded explanation. There was some point you were asking about.
Maybe it's the point that, or the suspicion that enlightenment, that there follows naturally from enlightenment a desire to hold up all beings,
Yes.
that it seems like that would just go hand in hand.
Yes, exactly. Okay, very good. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's... And the other thing you mentioned, you said, so is a bodhisattva the same as an arhat? That was
Yeah, I'm not...
So-
I realize that there's a distinction.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting how those doctrines have developed, in that regard. Well, my mind's just slipping. What did we have just a minute ago that we were going to talk about?
That enlightenment, that it follows naturally from enlightenment, that
It-
one would want the well-being.
According
of all.
to the Theravada definition of an arhat is somebody who has completely overcome the inherent sense of being a separate self.
Mm-hmm.
An arhat is a being who is completely and totally aware of the interconnectedness of all beings, and there is no separation between me and you. And the result of that view is that, of course, an arhat has no self at all. The idea of a selfish arhat
Mm-hmm.
is a total contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And when a person becomes an arhat, since they have no sense of self and they know that they are interconnected with everyone else, then it automatically comes from that every thought, word, and action is for the benefit of all beings, which are the imaginary parts of the whole. So in the Theravada definition, to be an Arahat, you cannot be an Arahat without being dedicated to the enlightenment of all being. It's just automatic because you know that there is no separation. As to whether a bodhisattva is an Arahat, as I say, in the Mahayana, they redefined Arahat as some selfish kind of enlightenment that makes a person free from suffering and happy, but still doesn't know that they're not a separate self. And so, because in the original doctrines it said that to become an Arahat is the end of the path. There's nothing past that. Then the Mahayana redefined it as Arahat's now this little side path, and a bodhisattva does his best to avoid becoming an Arahat because it means he can't go on and become a Sammasambuddha. So.
Oh, let's split some hairs.
What's that?
Let's split some hairs.
Oh, let me tell you that, if you're familiar with medieval Christianity and how many angels can dance on a pin, those folks had nothing on the Buddhists. Nothing at all on the Buddhists. Yeah.
And so is it apparent when one studies with a teacher in the Orient,
Yeah.
whether that teacher is from the Mahayana or the Theravada tradition? Is that a big difference?
It is a major difference, and it is a very big difference. And what you'll find in teachers of both traditions is, if they are Asian, is they will teach exactly from their tradition. And not only that, there is not one Theravada. The Thai Theravada in Buddhism is a little bit different than Sri Lankan and so on and so forth. In the same way, there's even more divergence between the different Mahayana traditions. And Eastern teachers will stick very closely to the doctrines of the school that they've been trained to. And I've had the most interesting experience of dealing with brilliant, and I would say at least somewhat enlightened teachers who, when you bring them up against the things that just start to unravel and don't make sense, are really, really skilled at just digging around them. They know there's a problem. It's absolutely unmistakable if you bring up these issues that they know that the doctrine, the standard doctrine, has a problem here. So they are very good at just getting around dealing with that. They will not say something that's in contradiction to the established doctrine.
Including the Dalai Lama.
Including the Dalai Lama.
Including the Dalai Lama.
Oh, including the Dalai Lama.
Have you met teachers? Have you met any teachers who have gone beyond doctrine?
Yeah, but they haven't been Eastern teachers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you see, this is what's always happened when Buddhism in northern India went into Ceylon, and it went into Southeast Asia, and it went into China. In each of these places, it went into these new areas, and there were teachers in these newly forming traditions to whom it was clear that there was traditional baggage that just wasn't useful. And so they had no hesitation. Like in Chinese Buddhism, they throw out a lot of things that are considered very important in Indian Buddhism. And so Buddhism took a form that suited the Chinese people. And the same thing happened in Sri Lanka, and the same thing happened in Burma and Taiwan, Burma, Thailand, and places like that. This is how the different forms of Buddhism have developed, and this is why you put them side by side, and you'll see that each one holds certain doctrines that are not shared with the other, but they're core doctrines that you find in all of them. The same thing's happening in the West. Buddhism comes to the West, and there are teachers who have no hesitation. I have no hesitation to say, yeah, this is a part of the doctrine, but you know, it makes no sense and it contradicts this and this and this, and, you know. And what will probably happen 500 years from now, if the world lasts that long, is there will be some form of American Buddhism that's so steeped in its own doctrines that its teachers will refuse to say that something's not true, even though in their own mind they know it's nonsense.
And at some point, if one departs from the doctrine farther and farther and farther, then it ceases to be Buddhism at some point. At some point, I would think, and it starts being what I see on the web as non-dualistic. Whatever, I think that's
well, and this has happened, and you know there are Buddhist traditions that other Buddhists don't believe are Buddhist traditions.
Mm-hmm. But the non-dualistic stuff is
the what?
The Advaita she's talking about.
Yeah. The Advaita is one example that you see. Some Western Buddhists are mingling Advaita together, but in some of the things that have been around for thousands of years, or at least many, many centuries, there is in the Pure Land Buddhism, there is a school that believes that if you chant the name of Buddha, you will earn the merit to be reborn in a Buddha heaven where there's a Buddha who has the power to enlighten you. And basically it's not possible for somebody to become enlightened in this world, so there's no point in trying. And people look at that form of Buddhism. That's just one form of one kind of Buddhism called Pure Land. But other Buddhists look at that and they say, well, absolutely not. The whole point of Buddhism is that you can become enlightened in this lifetime, that there is no being, even including a Buddha, who has the magical power to enlighten you, and therefore this belief isn't Buddhist.
Yeah.
But it's a part of Buddhism, nevertheless. And there is the Soka Gakkai Nichiren sect in Japan, who believes that all of the teachings of Buddha are garbage, that only the Lotus Sutra is the only thing that counts, and the only thing you have to do to achieve enlightenment is to chant the name of the Lotus Sutra. So if you sit there for a couple hours a day, you and your friends, and go Nam Myoho Renge Kyo over and over again, your enlightenment is guaranteed. But any of these other things are just a waste of time. So it's very different kinds of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And Soka Gakkai is a huge...
It's a huge it's a worldwide organization, a lot of followers.
Millions and millions of dollars and hundreds, probably millions of followers.
So they don't really teach the Eightfold Path.
No, they don't. They don't teach the sutras.
They teach the
Wow.
chanting.
Wow. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So yeah.
Oh, sweetheart, she wants to know what Advaita is.
Advaita. It's non-dual. It's okay. Vedanta is the Hindu system that basically is the idea that we have a true self, an Atman, which is really a manifestation of Brahman. And Brahman is sometimes regarded as just the supreme being, like God, and that the world and every person in it is being dreamed by Brahman, is a dream of Brahman. And so the Atman, our true self of any person, is identical with Brahman. And the goal of the spiritual path is to achieve this unification of the Atman with Brahman. Okay? And the Vedanta comes in two forms, the dualistic and the non-dual, or the dual and the non-dual. And the non-dual Vedanta is very, very similar to Buddhism. In the Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual Vedanta, nobody would ever think of referring to Brahman as a being or as a creator. Brahman is ultimate reality. Brahman is suchness. You know, Brahman is all of the words that in Buddhism are used to refer to it. So there's not much difference there. And this whole world is an illusion. And as each part of the illusion, our goal is to realize the ultimate truth. So becoming one with Brahman is realizing the ultimate truth. And at the core of all of the doctrines is all duality is an illusion. There is no two-ness. So anything that seems like self and other is an illusion, very Buddhist. Mind and matter as two separate things is an illusion, so on and so forth. Good and bad. Anything that you see as a duality is part of the illusion that you overcome as a part of the spiritual path. It's very, very similar to Buddhism. As a matter of fact, if there are parts of Buddhism that are hardly recognizable as Buddhist, I'd say of all the non-Buddhist traditions, Advaita Vedanta is almost indistinguishable in its core from the core teachings of Buddhism. And most of the differences that do exist are semantic, and if you look at them closely, they dissolve. And historically, in the middle period of Buddhism, Advaita and Buddhism had a huge impact on each other. Both of them borrowed heavily from the teachings of each other. So, in that regard, it's not too surprising how similar they are. But I'd be totally comfortable calling myself an Advaitist.
No, that was my next question. How does one, I mean, at what point did you decide to call yourself a Buddhist? Do you call yourself a Buddhist?
I call myself a Buddhist, although sometimes I cringe when I do that. Sometimes I call myself...
It's like calling oneself a Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like, you say, I'm a Buddhist, and there's so many different things that people believe are Buddhism, you're inviting them to put all kinds of labels on you that you don't really want to carry, But nevertheless, the teachings of the Buddha himself, if you distinguish between Buddhism as a religion and the Uposatha, the teaching of the Buddha himself, I'm totally a Buddhist in terms of the teachings of the Buddha himself. In terms of the different Buddhist religions and all those other things, not so much. Yeah.
I was wondering what the Vedanta is that teaches dualism.
What's that?
I was wondering about the Vedanta that teaches dualism.
Well,
What is that? Or
Well,
is it getting too often?
it's I don't know a lot about it except that philosophically it puts you in a position. I'm not totally sure, but I do think Krishna consciousness is a form of dualistic Vedanta. That's that there is this separation and there is a reliance on other power, and you use prayer and ceremony and things like that. So,
Yeah, I think.
yeah.
I know they think that, the Vedas say there's 3 forms of God realization. Brahman, which is what you just described. Paramatma, which is God within the heart.
Mhm.
And Bhagavan, which is seeing God as a person in a personal form.
Yeah.
And all of that goes with that.
Right.
And of course they think that's the topmost.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to see where things are, relative to each other.
Yeah. But what I have dedicated my life to is understanding and practicing what the Buddha taught. What the Buddha himself taught, and especially those things that are unique and special to the Buddha. And that's what I try to teach. And to greater or lesser degrees, depending on the circumstances and who I'm talking to, I'll go along with other people's views, as long as I don't feel like those, one or two things. I have no interest in persuading somebody of something different than what they believe. If it works for you, go for it. If it ever stops working so well for you, come talk to me. Maybe there's another way. Okay? The only time is if I feel like somebody has some uncertainty about a belief that they hold to, and I know that that belief is going to stand in the way of their further realization, then I feel free to give them the opportunity, to give them another point of view, so they have the opportunity to consider that perhaps they could shift their view a little bit and experience a richer and more satisfying path. And I will say that all of these different traditions in Buddhism, every one of them has developed truly wonderful things, truly wonderful practices, truly wonderful beliefs. You know, some of the things that come from Zen are so incredibly valuable that anybody on a spiritual path should make use of them. And there are some things. It's even, you know, even the ones, even in the Pure Land, there are things in the Pure Land that are so good that everyone should adopt them. So, all of these schools have generated things that are of tremendous value. But each one of them also carries a whole lot of other stuff with it, and sometimes that stuff just gets in the way.
Are there sources where those kinds of extractions have been compiled? Those things that, you know, the kernels of wheat, shall we say?
That is happening amongst Western Buddhist scholars, and their writings are incredibly difficult to read because they draw very heavily on Pali and Sanskrit sources, because as scholars, every statement they make, they have to present arguments for it, arguments against it, and rebuttals for the arguments against it. Every single point they make, and it's tough reading. But there's a lot of wonderful work being done in that area if you're up to the task. I think it's going to be a while before that stuff gets translated into a form that
For the laity?
Yeah, for the lay person to be able to absorb it. I love reading that stuff. It's hard to read, but you know, it really helps. It helps to clarify things. You know, if you study these things, if you are totally dedicated to a practice the way I am, there are things that come up, and you just don't know exactly what the significance of them is. And it's wonderful to find a Western scholar who's gone and analyzed this particular issue from the point of view of several different traditions and compared them and discussed them.
Yeah. Wow.
But as for what the Buddha himself taught, at one level, it's very simple. You know, and it's really worth, I think, presenting and becoming familiar with that in its simplest form, which the Four Noble Truths does. The Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path of cessation of suffering, really incorporates the whole into four manageable divisions. And, you know, I'm going to keep repeating this till everybody that ever comes to my talk can give it back to me. In a sentence, what did the Buddha teach?
Four Noble Truths. Oh, well.
No.
That there is no real, there's no reality to the self.
Suffering and the end of suffering.
Suffering and the end of suffering. Over and over again, when the Buddha was asked, or when somebody asked about what the Buddha, what is this Buddha's Dharma here? What is this guy teaching? The answer was, either from his own lips or from others, suffering and the end of suffering. So that is in its simplest form. All of the other things, the Four Noble Truths, is an elaboration of that. And the non-reality of the self, both personal and as a separate self, is an extremely important part of it. But in its simplest form, it's suffering and the end of suffering. But from there, it just, it grows into all kinds of other things. And to understand the first thing, I think is to understand suffering is really important. Because, well, first of all, when the Buddha presented the Four Noble Truths, and he presented the truth of suffering, he said, I'm going to tell you something that you've never heard from anyone else before. And I challenge you to find a book in English on the Four Noble Truths that says something about suffering that, as far as you can tell, everybody must have already known. In other words, most people aren't really getting what the Buddha had to say about suffering. And so, I'm going to give you another really easy formula. What did the Buddha say about suffering? He said, pain and pleasure are inevitable, suffering and happiness are optional. That is the truth of suffering. You look into that a little deeper.
Would you say it again? Just repeat it.
Pain and pleasure are inevitable. Living beings experience pain and pleasure. There's no way around it. But suffering and happiness, they're optional. And if you think of pain and pleasure as and suffering and happiness as scalar quantities, I've just lost everybody. If you think of them as belonging on a continuum of one thing, that pain isn't a pile of stuff over here and pleasure isn't a pile of stuff over here, but rather you go from extreme pain to no pain to pleasure to extreme pleasure. That they're all in the line. Same thing, suffering goes from extreme suffering to neutral to extreme bliss and happiness. So you can take that thing, and the way I stated it, you can simplify it and say, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And it means the same thing as pain and pleasure are inevitable, and suffering and happiness are optional, since when there is no suffering, there is only happiness. So that is the kernel of the truth of suffering. That's something that he said that nobody else had said before, and that to this day not very many people understand. Especially the part about suffering being optional. And then the Buddha went on, speaking about suffering, and here we have pain is dukkha. Dukkha is the word that he used. We use suffering. Okay. There is dukkha that is physical in origin. That's what we call pain, and that's what the Buddha called dukkha. And then there is suffering, which is the dukkha that is mental in origin, and that's domanassa dukkha. So there's two kinds of thing going on here. There's two kinds of unpleasantness, that comes from the body and that comes from the mind. And likewise, two kinds of pleasantness that come from the body and that come from the mind. And so then he further broke down the suffering aspect, the part that comes from the mind, the dukkha that comes from the mind, into three kinds. Well, actually, it's a division of all of suffering, but all of dukkha, but its real impact is in terms of the mental. Okay. You divide all of dukkha into three kinds. There is that kind that is there as a part of human life, and that includes all the physical pain, the dukkha. It also includes the kind of mental suffering that is the result of being a human being. We lose something and we grieve for that loss. Somebody dies and we feel grief, is an example. That as a human being, this kind of mental suffering is just your fundamental, basic, everywhere, every place kind of suffering. You lose your job, you break your leg. The physical pain causes mental suffering when you have a broken leg. Right? So there is all of the mental suffering that is rooted in the nature of the world and either comes from pain or else it comes from attachment to things of the world. So that's the one kind of suffering. The second kind is the result of impermanence. That accounts for the fact that even when things are going good, they're going to change. Even when you've got what you want, you're going to lose it. That everything is impermanent. The second is the suffering that is due to change. And it's acknowledging that not all suffering is what we usually think of as suffering. Your first bite of chocolate is really, really good. How good is the third piece of chocolate compared to the first? It's not as good, right? You fall in love with the person of your dreams. And in the midst of your ecstasy, you begin to worry that you might lose this person. Right? You're standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, taking in this incredible splendor, and you know that this is not going to last. So you go and grab your camera and you take as many pictures as you can, during which time you don't really get to appreciate the beauty of the camera because you're looking through a little hole, pushing a button. All of these things are examples of the suffering due to change, which often means just simply that even when good things are happening, we don't enjoy them as much as we could because we have attachment and because at some level we know they're going to pass away. So this is a kind of suffering that is always present just due to change. That's the second kind of suffering. The third kind of suffering is, to put it in modern terms, is existential suffering. The meaninglessness of everything. The hopelessness of life. In terms of these other two forms of suffering, the first is absolutely inescapable, and the second is fleeting. The second is due to the fleetingness of things. To look at life and say, how can I become fully happy? What's going to give my life meaning? The existential kind of suffering comes from the fact that we want security, we want meaning, we want purpose, we want something that we can hold on to and believe in. And ultimately there is nothing. So that's the third kind of suffering. Did I explain that clearly enough? So you have physical pain, you have this first kind of suffering that's rooted in physical pain and rooted in attachment to things of the world. And the second kind of mental suffering that is rooted in the transiency of things. And the third kind of suffering that is rooted in the fact that all of our search for some solid ground to give our life meaning and purpose is doomed to fail. So these are the sufferings that the Buddha recognized. And he said, and the surprising, wonderful, good news that he brought is that only pain is inevitable. The suffering that results from pain and the suffering that results from attachment is optional. You don't have to have it. The suffering due to impermanence is optional. You don't have to have it. The suffering that is due to the existential situation of being the kind of beings we are and the kind of universe this is doesn't have to happen. It's optional. That's the truth of suffering. And then he moved on to the second truth, which is the truth of the cause of suffering. Not the cause of pain, it's there, but the cause of suffering. And it is very simply, the way that you usually hear it is the cause of suffering is craving. Yes?
I'm sorry, before you move to the second, the cause of the suffering,
Yeah.
could you elaborate a little bit more about the third kind of that, the suffering? If we find so hard and try so hard and realize there is no meaning, no purpose, no the solid ground of the meaning of life,
Mm-hmm. How can we get away from that suffering?
yeah, that's the thing.
Okay.
And I think that is even huge than the
Well,
impermanent.
That is a very good question. And it has exactly the same cause as all of the other suffering. Its cause is attachment to wanting things to be different than the way they are. The cause of existential suffering is wanting things to be different than the way they are. Wanting there to be a God, wanting there to be some source of meaning, wanting to be some intelligence somewhere that's laid it all out and everything happens for a reason and a purpose. It's our attachment to wanting that is the cause of the existential suffering. So it's exactly the same as the cause of every other kind of suffering. Wanting things to be different than they are and being attached to the idea of them being different than they are. If I want gold and I'm attached to the idea of having gold, when I don't have gold, I suffer. If I want a universe that is logical, rational, purposeful, has an end, designed by some brilliant consciousness, if I want that, if I don't find that, I'm going to suffer, and that is existential suffering. But it's only due to the fact that I'm wanting it and I'm attached to it, that I'm making myself suffer because it isn't that way.
But isn't we say that we all looking for the meaning of our life and find out
That's right.
what's the purpose
Well,
and what?
this is a little bit of a digression, but as it turns out, since the meaning of the life isn't something from outside that you can look for and find, which is actually a kind of dualistic view, is that I'm me and I'm real, and there is a God or a Brahman or a creator or somebody else, and that being has all the meaning. And if I look hard enough, I'm going to find that meaning, and then I'm going to be happy.
Oh, you mean the meaning is that meaning? It's not the life.
The answer is that the search for meaning outside your own consciousness
Oh, I see.
is
It's outside.
the mistake.
Okay, but still need to searching for inside the consciousness.
Yeah, but you're not going to find a meaning inside that came from anywhere else. You make the meaning of your existence.
Okay.
Your life has no meaning except for the meaning that you give to it.
I see. Mm-hmm. Okay, but is
With-
that suffering too? Is I give the meaning and that would be suffering?
The idea of wanting a meaning to be there independently from its own side. The meaning of life is empty. There is no meaning of life from its own side. There is no meaning of life independent of our mind's projection of it. That's what emptiness is. Emptiness is that things do not exist from their own side the way they appear to be. Meaning of life is empty from its own side. Okay? But just as everything else has a kind of existence for your own mind, all the meaning you ever need is there. But it's not from its own side. It's from your side only.
But I kind of like the thing that I attached to at one point that said, "Man is that he may know joy." So I've used
Yeah.
that as a works.
And that is you know, there are a lot of things like that that hold such profound truth. I mean, anything that's really profound, anything you can say in half a dozen words or less that holds profound truth, you have to dive into in a deep way to touch that truth. But it's there. You know, the way I like to put exactly the same thing you say. You said, man is to know joy. It sounds very noble. I say, we're just here to have fun. Means exactly the same thing. And it gets ultimately, if you take it deeply enough, past our superficial interpretations of what it means to have fun. If you take it deeply enough, it is a really, really profound truth. It is the answer to the existential dilemma. We're just here to have fun. Man is to know joy. Yeah. And the Buddha realized that. See, we can. There's so much more that we can elaborate on this thing, but just to ground the little bit that we've talked about as solidly as possible. If you look at the Buddha's life, the Buddha was of the warrior class. His dad was a feudal lord of a small fiefdom in northeastern India. And it was a time in India's history where there was a lot of affluence. There was a lot of surplus. Agriculture had produced a huge surplus. And so you had these little fiefdoms, and whoever was the ruler, the king, chief, whatever you call it, enjoyed huge abundance of everything. But they entertained themselves by constantly attacking each other, and they all maintained standing armies, both for defense and so that if they decided to see if they could take over the next kingdom, that they could. The Buddha was born the son of this kind of a chieftain. So he enjoyed extreme luxury for the times at least. I don't think he had HD TV. But extreme luxury as he grew up. He was groomed to replace his father as the warrior chief of this kingdom. And in those days, the reason that the reasoning behind all of the benefits to being the king is that the king was responsible for his people, for the happiness and well-being of his people, to protect them from having somebody from the next kingdom come and take things away, to make sure that there wasn't too much in the way of robbing and killing and stuff like that, to impose laws. So the ruler had a lot of responsibility towards his people. The Buddha grew up in this sheltered, affluent, luxurious life. And one of the things that's recounted is that he woke up one morning after a night of debauchery, and all the courtesans are laying around half undressed, snoring with saliva dripping from their mouth and things like that. This is the description. And he just thought it was all disgusting. And then he was confronted with sickness, old age, and death, and realized that for him, for everyone, that this was inevitable. Sickness means not just an infection, but all of the different kinds of injuries and suffering that the body is prone to. and then there's old age, and then there's death. And for himself, I think he was very aware of the existential dilemma. He got married. We don't know how much he wanted to get married, but it was very important that he get married, and he get married to the woman that would seal the greatest alliances between his father's kingdom and somebody else's, so he got married. And he had a child, and I can't help but think that in his mind it's this, what is the point of all this? So now I'm about to take on all this responsibility for all of these people that I can't possibly live up to. We're all going to get sick, old, and die. Here I am, married, this child is born, and he's going to grow up, get sick, and die. What is the meaning, what is the point of this? So he had in his mind, I think, all of these kinds of suffering really clearly, and the question is, what, there's got to be a way out of this. And that's why he left home. And he followed. The sickness, old age, and death were 3 or 4 messengers, and the 4th was seeing an ascetic monk in robes. And so he left home, left this kingdom behind, left all of these things behind, and some people might think this was a great sacrifice, but I don't think so. I think he was trying to get away from this. It wasn't that, oh well, I'm this noble person on the search, so I have to give up all this pleasure. Much as no, it was like, holy hell, I'm not going to do this another day. I am out of here, and nobody's going to stop me. Yeah. And so he went and he studied with the most renowned teachers of his day, Alara Kalama and Dr. Ramaputta. And they were following a major trend in Vedic thought in those days, which we talked about earlier, that the belief was that you were on this endless cycle of rebirth. And what a dreary thing that you're going to go through this. I mean, if you're aware of the existential dilemma, the only thing that makes it worse is that you're going to have to keep going through the same thing over and over and over again. And so the goal was to escape from the cycle of reincarnation. To achieve Brahman was thought to be how this was achieved. And these spiritual teachers that he went to claimed to have found the answer, the end of samsara, the end of suffering. And so the Buddha went and studied with them, and he learned, from the first he learned the jhana practices through what's known as the base of nothingness. And the idea of this practice was that if you entered this jhana and you spent long enough sitting in this jhana, for one thing, it didn't hurt that the jhana itself was a sublimely pleasant way to pass your time. But in terms of the real goal of the path as they saw it, that when you entered into this jhana of nothingness, you were actually experiencing the union with Brahman. And if you did enough of this in your life, when you died, you would achieve final union with Brahman and you wouldn't be reborn. So his first teacher, and he mastered those teachers, and he sat in the jhana of nothingness. And the teacher said, great, you understand all the doctrines, you understand the method. How about you and me? We'll teach all my students together. You'll be my fellow teacher. And the Buddha said, I wasn't looking for something that's going to solve my problems after I'm dead. I'm looking for an answer to the problem of suffering in this life. So, nice as it is to sit in jhana with you, and as appealing as the idea is that if I do it enough, I won't get reborn and have to go through this whole thing again, it's not what I was looking for. He went to his next teacher, who went to the next higher jhana, which was the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And he mastered that as well, and all the teachings that go with it. But the underlying principle was the same. You sit in this jhana, and not too shabby a way to pass your life, letting other people feed you, and you sit in these blissful jhanas, and then when you die, you'll become enlightened. And he said the same thing to that teacher, who actually offered him to, here, take all my students, you be the guru. He said, no, thank you. That's not what I'm looking for. And he took up the practice of asceticism, because by this point I think he had realized that suffering is the mind's reaction to the pain that is inevitably part of the world. He'd gotten that far in his understanding of things. And there were these schools who practiced extreme asceticism with the idea that they were going to overcome the mind's reaction to pain by enduring it. And so for several years he practiced these extreme austerities, all designed to bring the mind to the point where it was immune to physical pain, so that you could stand on one leg staring at the sun, lay on a bed of nails, not eat. Some of the things he describes are really far out. Not breathing. He would hold his breath until he thought his head would explode. All of these things are an attempt to try to use the mind to transcend the tendency of the mind to struggle against physical discomfort and generate suffering. The Buddha himself described it as using the mind to crush the mind. So he spent several years doing the practices of using the mind to crush the mind. And he came to the conclusion, this is not working. He said in his own words, he said, there has never been and there never will be anybody who's given this more of their best effort than I have. No one will ever practice these austerities to a more extreme degree than I have. And it did not work, and it's never going to work. So he decided to quit and try something different. So at that point, he was trying to decide what to do, and he remembered an experience that he'd had as a child. We've all had absorptions, which jhanas is a kind of absorption that happens in meditation. And he had experienced an absorption as a child while his father was doing a plowing ceremony. And he knew all about absorptions because he'd already practiced the jhanas with the foremost teachers of the time. What struck him when he remembered it, though, is the joy he felt. And he said, could this be the answer? He said, my gosh, I think it is. This joy that is not from the senses. And so then he went and he practiced. Now I think the clue that you can see the clue that he got here is that the suffering and the happiness both are not due to things outside. They're due to what's happening inside. And that the source of joy, the source of suffering, and the source of joy are both from within. So he had figured that out. Before he sat down under that tree, he knew really clearly that all of the mental suffering is created by the mind itself, and if I can only find out how and why the mind does this, I'll have a chance of achieving my goal. Not only that, I already know that the mind itself is able to create its own joy and happiness. That joy and happiness are not dependent upon things outside of the mind. And actually what he had learned at this point, partly through the way he was raised and partly through his practice of austerities, is that the source of happiness is not outside. That there is no amount of wealth and pleasure and things like that is going to ever bring you happiness. So now he had all the pieces coming together. He had, I think before he sat down, he had the first noble truth knocked out. The question was, what is the cause of suffering? And remember, the flip side of the cause of suffering is what can be the cause of perfect happiness. When there is no suffering, there's bliss. And that's what he sat down and found out. That's what he discovered. Which is what brings us, later on he taught the Eightfold Path, which is part of the Four Noble Truths. And he discovered that suffering comes from craving. It's from wanting things to be different than the way they are. And when he taught the second Noble Truth, he didn't say, and the cause of all your suffering is craving. If you read what he said that, but that was just the beginning. He said, and if you let go of craving, the suffering will disappear. And he gave an instruction. And the instruction was to practice doing that. When you find yourself suffering, find the root of the suffering and let it go. And if you do, the suffering disappears. It may come back again a moment later, but the suffering disappeared. That this confirms for you that you indeed know what the cause of suffering is. It is wanting things to be different than the way they are, and being attached to them being different than the way they are. And if you let go of that attachment, and if you accept the way things are, however long you do that, whether it's for a second, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, half an hour, you're going to be free of whatever that particular suffering was that was being caused by that particular attachment that you let go of. That is the second Noble Truth. The third truth is that he had found a way to the complete and permanent cessation of suffering. Now, you can go through your whole life with so many different kinds of suffering coming at you and trying to identify what it is that I'm attached to and let go of it, and all it's going to do is give you momentary vacations from the suffering of life. The third Noble Truth is, hey, that just gives me a headache thinking about it. There's a way that you can get there and stay there permanently. And that's where the no self comes from. That he figured out the craving part of it. Suffering is due to craving. It's due to desire for things, for something that isn't, or it's due to aversion to something that is. Craving is wanting things to be different. So he had that figured out. And he had figured out that it was absolutely all happening in here. And if you could let go of that attachment, it would go away. So the question really is, well, why does my mind keep doing this? And he went a little deeper and found that it's because I believe I'm a separate self, or my mind believes it is a separate self. And so, and my mind believes that happiness and pain come from outside. Happiness and suffering come from outside. And so my mind does what's logical. Since it is a separate self and its happiness and suffering are dependent upon self-existent things out there, it keeps wanting things that it doesn't have, or wanting not to have things that it does have. So he found that the root of craving, desire and aversion, are rooted in delusion. And I'm going to stop using the word ignorance, which is what avidya is usually translated as. And in English, ignorance means the absence of knowledge of something. And that is not what the Buddha meant by the word that's being translated as ignorance. He meant delusion. It's believing you are something you're not, believing the world is something that it's not, and believing that your happiness and your suffering come from an interaction between those two imaginary things that does not exist. That's ignorance. So he realized that if you can overcome ignorance, then you can overcome craving. And if you can overcome craving, then you will have achieved the complete, perfect cessation for all time of suffering. And that was the third truth. And the fourth truth, which I'm going to spare you today. The fourth truth is how to get from where you are to there.
Which is the subject of your book,
Yeah,
right?
in part.
Okay.
But in terms of what Buddhism really is, in terms of what the Buddha really taught, these things that I've covered with you this morning are absolutely unmistakable. There can be no confusion anywhere. The confusion comes with, in terms of the third truth, the complete and final cessation. Some people say, well, there's no way that we can there's no way we can overcome this confusion. I tried and gave up. So there must be a Buddha and a Buddha paradise who will do it for me. That's where the confusion starts. But up to this point, this is solid, indisputable. Every form of Buddhism, they differ in terms of the fourth noble truth, how you get there. But it's all the same. Buddha taught suffering and the end of suffering. He taught that suffering is due to the mind's rejection of what is and attachment to what it imagines. And that behavior of the mind is rooted in the erroneous belief in the reality of the self and the reality of the world as it's perceived. So in every school of Buddhism, you're going to find those things, without exception. Yes.
Now, I have two questions. I ask each one. Okay. Then if the second noble truth talk about the cause, and Buddha realized that is the mind, cause the suffering.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what's that the jhana practice he experienced for the two teachers helping for this? Because it sounds like if realize that is a mind, and how the jhana practice play in role to helping this.
Well,
Can you repeat your question?
yeah, I have to, because I'm not sure. So, are you asking, because the Buddha went on, spent the rest of his life teaching people to do jhana practice. Are you asking why and how the jhana practice helps?
Yeah, because you see the when he sat down the tree, before that he already sees thoroughly for all the suffering, right? Then he sat down is find out what's the cost of the suffering.
Yeah.
Okay, so sounds like from I hear from you is cost that is pretty much he get a conclusion is because it is my thinking and cause of the suffering.
Thinking?
My attachment, is wanting, and
the
my
behavior
is
of the mind of attaching and wanting, desiring is the cause of the suffering.
yeah. So if the others say that if the mind is not wanting and mind is not that, then we're no suffering. Right?
That's right.
Okay. And my question is I just don't understand, because he tried so many years and master the jhana practice, but still not get understanding for the suffering and that.
Yeah.
And then my question is that then later on practice that, but seems like at those years he is practicing jhana, even though get into such deep jhana, he cannot understand that.
Yes,
so what's the
what's the difference between the
not the
jhana
difference?
that made
What's
him
that
enlightened?
helping to?
What's the difference between
other-
the jhana that made him enlightened and the jhanas he practiced before?
Yeah, because I almost see this mind
Okay.
want to pursue the jhana,
Yeah.
but seems like go through the Buddha's the
This is a very important question. It's so important I'm going to answer it even though we've gone over time. A very important question. The jhanas, as an absorption, don't necessarily involve introspective awareness. Right?
Okay.
They don't necessarily. And the jhanas that the Buddha learned, the idea was get to the deepest state of jhana as fast as you can. And so he was good at it. So he got there. And if you get there as fast as you can, you don't learn anything along the way. And if you haven't previously learned to have awareness, especially introspective awareness, your chances of learning anything along the way are just about zero. You know, it's like if you were going to go from here to LA and you were looking through a little tube and all you could see was the road so that you could tell when you got off the road, you could get to LA from here. but you'd have no idea of what was in between. And that's exactly the way they were practicing the jhanas. What the Buddha taught that was totally different. You see, he was approached by a Brahmin who asked him and said, okay, so, how can I become enlightened? And the Buddha told him, practice the jhanas with mindfulness, with sati sampajana, with introspective awareness, looking at your own mind. It's not getting to the jhana that's important. It's everything that you learn along the way. And when he describes how Sariputra became enlightened, how Sariputra became an arhat, practicing the jhanas, he said that Sariputra examined the mind before jhana, in jhana, and arising from jhana, and noticed the difference. And he moved on to the next jhana and noticed before and during and noticed the difference. It is the practice of introspective awareness in the jhana, before the jhana, and after the jhana that reveals the truth. Let me put this a little differently. The first thing that he realized, not even through practicing it, but through recollection, was that there is joy and happiness that has nothing to do with anything outside of you. That was the realization. When he had practiced the jhanas with these other teachers, there's no question he experienced joy and bliss. But he didn't notice that, oh, there's something special about this. This comes only from my mind, has nothing to do with anything outside of that. So this was an important clue. And so by practicing the jhanas with mindfulness, and if anything, the Buddha, when he sat down under the tree, he was not, you see, the way they practiced the jhanas before, it was like a ritual. It was magic. The jhanas were fun to do, but the whole point was you were going to have this magical thing happen after you died. It was about magic. And the Buddha knew that didn't work. So when he sat down under the Bodhi tree and practiced the jhanas, he wasn't waiting for some magic to happen. And I'll just say the point that all of those meditators out there in the world who sit down to meditate waiting for some magic to happen, they can do that for another 10,000 lifetimes. There is no magic that's going to happen. The Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree and said, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to watch what happens. And that's where the answers came. That's how he came to know the things that he taught. The cause of suffering is my mind's reaction. The cause of happiness is my mind's non-attachment. And why does my mind keep attaching, and why does my mind keep reacting this way? Oh, it's because I believe that I'm a separate self. So the difference between the Buddha's practice of jhana, by which he became enlightened, and Udaka Ramaputta and Alara Kalama, his teachers that he learned from, is the Buddha practice with sati sampajana, with introspective mindful awareness. Well, we're calling metacognitive introspective mindful awareness. Observing what was really going on. The result of that observation is insights. A lot of little aha experiences. Seeing how things really are and contemplating that and then looking again to see what else you could find. And those insights are what resulted in his being enlightened.
So our the jhana practice we are practice now add for the awareness. Beside that, we also kind of looking for insight during the jhana practice. Is that right?
Well, that's right. You don't have to look for the insight. You just have to be looking. If you practice jhana and you're in a state of observing rather than just getting lost in it, the insight's going to come. Reality's there all the time, in every minute. The most perfect ultimate reality you could ever wish to know is right here in this instant. And in jhana, if you are in the jhana and you are in a state of awareness, it's going to pop out. The insights are going to start to pop out.
So let me address that to see if I understand clearly. So the practice jhana is now I want to go to first and second and third jhana. It's not that. It's in the process, how I
Exactly.
observe the things, the go to which stage of the jhana is
Exactly.
not that important than the process
That's
for,
right.
for looking and observing, keeping observing, doing that.
Yeah.
Then what insight will come and the awareness will increase.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right.
Oh, okay.
That's right. It's not about, going from here to Los Angeles. It's not about getting to Los Angeles as fast as you can. It's more like go back and forth between Tucson until you really know every inch of the way. When you know every inch of the way, go from Tucson to Gila Bend back and forth till you know every inch of the way. That's why you practice the second jhana. And then you go back and forth from Gila Bend to Blythe until you understand every inch of the way. That's like mastering the third jhana. And then, so forth. That's how you practice the jhana. It's not, I'm going to get there as fast as I can, because you're going to get there and you're not going to be anywhere different than where you started.
Mm-hmm. I see. Understand now. Thank you.
对吧？你能帮我问一个问题吗？
Oh, sure.
出禅跟出国是不一样的，有出禅不一定有出国。那出国是不是一定他有达到出禅？
Okay. Sophia has a question that she realized the string entry and having the first jhana is different. Okay, it's not equal. But her question is that if the person get to the string entry, is that mean that the person have to already achieve the first practice master the first jhana?
No. Practicing the jhana is a good way to achieve stream entry, but you don't have to. But when you achieve stream entry, it will become very, very easy to practice jhana. So a stream, if someone has never practiced jhana, never entered jhana, after they become a stream entrant, it will be much, much easier after that.
So which way for us to aim to the string entry first will be better, or aim to the
Stream entry. Go for that.
and to the jhana will be
Well, your aim should always be you should always be aimed at the insight that will make you a stream entrant. But it's like practicing the 10 stages. You can achieve insight at every single stage. It's always possible. And you could achieve stream entry before you got past stage 3. It's possible. But if you finish stage 3 and you haven't achieved stream entry yet, do stage 4. If you have samatha and you haven't achieved stream entry yet, practice jhana. If you've mastered the first jhana and you haven't achieved stream entry yet, practice second jhana. But yeah, your goal is to achieve the insight that leads to awakening, and all of these other things, including, I'm talking about samatha and jhana, but including, the noting style of vipassana practice and Goenka's style of all of these things, doing Mahamudra in the Tibetan tradition, practicing Tantra. They're all just ways, if you practice these ways, to help you have the insights to bring you to awakening.
no. Okay.
Thank you for that question.